Welcome to the event. As I keep on saying, it's fantastic to see so many people here. This is the first dissemination event that we have for this project. So we're exploring narratives and environmental challenges, as you hopefully all know. So this is the first dissemination activity, and this is going to act a little bit more as an introduction of some of the things that we've been working on. We're going to have a bit of a follow-up workshop in a couple of weeks' time. I'll share the details with that a little bit later. And hopefully if things in here have piqued your interest, what that event should do, it should give us a lot more time to explore some of the ideas that we introduce here in detail and apply it to a couple of case studies that we have lined up as well. So like I say, I'll talk a bit more about that in later in the webinar. I will also be introducing the project team, but by way of introduction, I'll talk a little bit about them just here. So we have John Pictured. John is from the Departments of Mathematics and Biology here at the University of York. And John works on a variety of research areas. And that includes mathematical biology and ecology, dynamical systems and stochastic processes. And as we've talked about a little bit so far, he's also most recently leading a NERC project called Pyramids of Life, which looks at sustainable future for fisheries. We also welcome here Lindsay Stringer. Lindsay joins us from the Environment and Geography Department, again here at the university, and her research focuses on human-environment relationships. And she works also across a vast range of environmental challenges. She joins us fresh from the IPCC, where she's been involved in Working Group 2 of the 6th Assessment Report. And they've been having negotiations then when she's been a leader. She's been a lead author on the chapter on poverty, livelihoods and sustainable development. She's also been a coordinating lead author on a cross-chapter paper on desert, semi-arid areas and desertification. And she's also a lead author on the technical summary and the summary for policymakers. So we're going to hear a bit more about Lindsay, a little bit more from Lindsay later on. Finally, I'll welcome Richard. So Richard joins us from the English and Literature Department here at the university, and his work is in narrative theory, which you'll hear a lot more about in just a few moments. We could have no better person to work on this project with us. So he's the director of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Narrative Studies here at the university, and he's also the founder of the British and Irish Association for Narrative Studies. And I am the odd one out. So I don't have a specialty. I guess if I was being generous to myself, I would say that I am a generalist. My background is in lots of things. It's in civil engineering. I have also worked in secondary education. I've done some work in climate change. But with this hat on, I think that this lets me be the lay person within this group. And in that role, I am going to be providing you with a lay introduction. So I apologise to Richard in advance for oversimplifying everything that we've been learning through this project. To correct that, after that, I'm going to be handing over to Richard to explore some of the ideas that we've been looking at. And what I'm going to do, if that's okay with you, is if you can hold on to any questions that you have for just after Richard's talk, because what we're going to do at that point is we're going to have a discussion and some questions, talking about some of the ideas that will have arisen during Richard's talk. And we're going to also bring in Lindsay and John at that time. And we'd like to explore some of the opportunities that they see for this work in some of the areas of environmental challenges that they work in. Wonderful. So I guess the first thing to talk about is what is a narrative, which I almost forgot to talk about. Richard mentioned that this would be my folk description of what a narrative is, which is a kind way of saying that this is the lay interpretation, I suppose. So a narrative, from my understanding, describes a series of events. And it's really hard to talk about narratives without using the word story. I know that it's something that I conflated when we first started doing this project, but it's, as we've talked about it a little bit more, it's an important distinction between what a story is and what narrative is. So a story is linked to narrative, of course. So a story is an example of the use of narrative. It's important for us to not interchange them, though, because a story is quite often something that we associate with fiction, and fiction is not something that we want associated with our research. So we're going to try to stick to using the word narrative rather than story, even though story is the thing that often pops into people's heads when we do talk about narrative. Of course, the first thing that I do on the very next slide is use the word story. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to give this speech about the power of a good story, but I suppose this is the reason why I wanted to be involved in this project. We know this, we've heard this 1,000 times, how powerful narratives are in communication. The thing that I've learned from this, and one of the most interesting things that I've learned about narratives, is that they are so much more than that. Narratives are actually, in addition to being a form of communication, a way that we communicate, narratives are a way that we make sense of the world. So narratives, we use narratives for cognition, for sense making. The best way to describe that might be through an example. So this is a different way that we use of trying to understand the world around us. And that is through this very elegant, beautiful mathematical approach. So we can understand a phenomenon within the world through this. Sadly for me, it's not something that immediately pops into my mind and helps me to understand this phenomenon. So what we'll do instead is that instead of the mathematical approach to understanding this phenomenon, we'll try to use a narrative approach. And this narrative approach starts with a box. In the box, there's a cat. And along with the cat, because I'm a terrible person, I've put a vial of poison. And there's a 50-50 chance, 50-50% chance that that vial of poison will break at any given time. And I'm going to tape up, the cat isn't real, by the way. So I'm going to tape up the box, and we're going to walk away. And then we're going to come back, say after an hour. Now, if we look at the box, because that vial has a 50-50 chance of breaking and releasing that poison, if we were to think about this from a quantum physics point of view, before we open the box, that cat is both alive and it's dead at the same time. And if we think of it in this quantum physics point of view, it's only when we peek inside that box that we essentially force nature to decide on whether it's going to show us alive or a dead cat. And this is Schrodinger's cat. But this is meant to demonstrate, it's meant to be a thought experiment which demonstrates one of the philosophically disturbing or the spooky aspects of quantum physics. And that aspect is called superposition, which then is meant to relate to subatomic particles which do exist as with this duality, with this dual form of state. And in that case, they reveal one of their states when you observe them. So as you can see from this, it's trying to help us to understand a phenomenon, the same phenomenon as that mathematical approach was trying to get through to us. And what you can see is it was really powerful. We managed to get there in a few sentences. Hopefully, it's something that can pop into your head and you kind of go, oh, that is a bit spooky. This also demonstrates, though, for me, one of the reasons why I'm quite nervous in using narratives to describe research. It's extremely powerful. It's really powerful in helping us to understand a phenomenon. But as you can see, it gets us so far, but we can't describe quantum physics using a cat. So there is that gap there. There's a limitation to the narrative, and then there's a gap there that we can't quite close with the narrative. So we can't quite fully explain that phenomenon. And for me, this is something that's a vulnerability for using narratives and kind of puts me off a little bit, if I'm honest, from using that power of the narrative. Hopefully in this project, what we're aiming to do is to explore what makes the narrative work, and hopefully explore why that narrative, why there are limitations and what that limitation is and why that's there. And hopefully by gaining a bit more of an understanding about how those narratives work, we can overcome that vulnerability that we feel with using narratives and feel a little bit more empowered, a little bit more confident in using the narrative more freely to describe some of the findings of our research. I'm going to be handing over to Richard in a moment, who's obviously our expert in narrative theory, who's going to be telling us a little bit more about the narratives. But just to finish up with this example, one of the things that I learned from this is that in this case, the narrative here worked because we changed the scale, and we changed the scale from the subatomic particle level, and we scaled that up to a human level. And that's why there was that power in that narrative. And obviously, because we can't describe quantum physics with cats, that's why also there was that gap there, that limitation. So to summarize where we've got up to with this lay person's introduction to this, narratives describe a series of events, and they're a very important and really powerful means, not only of communication, but also of sense making, of cognition, of understanding the world. Narratives also have limitations. So I'm going to hand over to Richard next, and Richard's going to talk to us about his area of research, which is narrative theory. And this is something that originated in literary studies. And narrative theory essentially looks at how the narrative works. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Richard.
Thank you, Annabelle. Okay, let me just share my screen. Right, there we go. Let's go back on. Hang on. I hope everybody can see that. Thank you to Annabelle for the introduction there. One of the things that was explicit there was the way in which narrative theory both has origins in literary study and is interdisciplinary in scope. And the way I wanted to get into what I have to say today was by taking up that theme of the interdisciplinary dialogue that's inherent in this particular project and others that I've been in. I was particularly appreciative of the way in which my partners in this group were very solicitous in checking that I did not feel that I was being brought in as some kind of service for the purposes of this project, in order to basically tell them how to tell the right kinds of narratives. And in fact, I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel like that because if that was the case, my response would have to be that it just isn't that easy. And the reasons why it's not that easy are of theoretical interest to me. And so that the dialogue is genuinely two-way in this kind of discussion. What I did actually as part of introducing the idea of narrative theory to everybody was to make available to them a range of my own kind of previous interdisciplinary work on narrative theory. That's to say, I've done quite a lot on narrative cognition, or on narrative and scientific communication, or on narrative and complex systems, including by the way, the edited volume Narrating Complexity, which I co-edited with Susan Stepney, who's I'm glad to see here today as well. All of those things that struck me as useful contexts, interdisciplinary contexts for our own discussion. So imagine my surprise when they came back saying that the thing that grabbed them most immediately was a paper I presented with this title here, some commonsensical and uncontentious theses on narrative and spatiality, leavened by a perverse reading of Robbe-Griet's Jealousy. Now, this was a paper presented to a literary audience, an audience of narrative theorists. And for those of you not familiar with the tone and idiom of papers in literary study, this is being highly ironic, not to say satirical, in its gesture. So I was surprised and a little bit disconcerted initially that my colleagues had seized upon this, because I was clearly worried that they had, at the very least, not grasped the irony that was part of the argument of this paper. But in order to give you some idea of how that that concern was dissipated, and how indeed it arose and becomes, in a way, a more interesting feature of the whole situation. I just wanted to I won't of course repeat the paper itself to you, but I'll just run you through a little bit of what I was doing in that particular presentation. And I'll do that by showing you some of the slides I actually used with the presentation. Rogueret's Jealousy, for those who don't know, is a French nouveau roman, a quite avant-garde novel, one in which, on the one hand, there is a very complicated and disrupted narration. On the other hand, there's an enormous amount of very, very specific description. And my target in this paper was the conventional wisdom in narrative theory, that what you do when you read a novel is you reconstruct the fictional world of the novel. So in a facetious manner, I decided to take that principle very, very seriously and literally, and to begin doing that with this particular novel. It's facilitated by the fact that in the English translation, at least, there is a plan of the main scene of the novel included at the beginning, which was obviously drawn up on the basis of information culled from the novel itself. And with, as you can see, a lot of quite specific, there's a key with these numerals in it, quite a lot of specific information, and I'll come back to that later. But I wanted to go further, because if you can do that, then surely you can also extend beyond that to the plantation surrounding the villa. Indeed, there's a lot of extremely specific description of these rows of banana trees, banana palms, that allows you to be quite accurate in the way that you determine where those are and how many there are in each row. And indeed, the curve of this particular stream, according to the different lengths of the rows on the far bank there, and indeed the exact configuration of these replacement logs for the log bridge over the stream. All these things, are derived from not randomly or fancifully, but from specific bits of information in the novel, as is the larger scene within which we might set the plantation, this plateau to the north with a rocky outcrop and a rocky spur, and beyond that, the setting of the novel as a whole within Martinique, the capital Fort-de-France. There is the other place that features in the novel, not by name, but implicitly. And so that's where the plantation might be supposed to be, somewhere over there. And that, of course, gives you a geolocation for the setting of the novel itself. But that's not all. You might also begin to construct a three-dimensional model of the world of the novel. There's information on the basis of which to do that, and this is the basic structure that you get from that. And indeed, you can flesh that out in quite a lot of detail, including some very, very specific information, such as, for example, the exact number of slats on these jealousy blinds in the windows in the villa. But you may have noticed that plan includes one curious feature, which is this shadow. Whoever drew the plan didn't actually understand how shadows work, but that is meant to be the shadow of the pillar at the corner of the veranda of the villa, and it's in the position that it is in at the opening of the novel. So I took up that. I also went to show that, well, now we have a three-dimensional model and we have a geolocation for this villa. We can actually begin to use the positions of this shadow as a kind of solar clock. And using a program called SketchUp. You can then identify, by configuring that particular position for the light, a time and a date in the year. So it's 2:20 on the 26th of March for that opening scene in the novel. So we now have a spatiotemporal kind of fix notionally on this particular scene, and indeed on later very, very specifically described scenes in the novel. And that, on the face of it, seems quite interesting, because this, as I said, is quite a convoluted novel where the chronology of events is not at all clear. Now, the whole thrust of that was extremely facetious. And indeed, the title, the claim that these theses, those are the theses that I presented on that page there, are commonsensical and uncontentious, was equally facetious, given that I knew very well that most, if not all, of my fellow narrative theorists would disagree profoundly with some, perhaps many, of those theses. So the rhetoric of this thing gave me great concern as to how it had been taken up by my colleagues from this project. But in fact, you'll notice that throughout this, I've been talking about fiction, and I framed these 10 theses in relation to narrative. And I was doing that partly in order not to beg the question of fiction, because that was the crux of my argument with my fellow narrative theorists. The point being that understanding fiction, especially understanding a fiction like Rogier's Jealousy, is something much better understood at the level of the communicative act of narration, and indeed the texture, in this case, the texture of the linguistic surface of the narrative, than it is in relation to a represented world that supposedly we get access to through the narrative. But suppose we think of that as my partners on this project think of it, not in the context of fiction, but in the context of the real world, and the ways in which we may indeed be concerned with the question of how to mediate the real world through one or other communicative resources, and narrative being a candidate, one of those. Then the same kinds of issues, and in particular these ones, which were the ones that they seized upon in particular detail, come up from that perspective too, and come up in a very different light, perhaps. The first of these, number 3 there, narrative cognition, is the semiotic articulation of linear temporal sequence. This is really to take a step further that kind of folk definition of narrative that Annabelle gave at the beginning, which is to say that whereas what she gave as a definition, and indeed what almost every definition of narrative you might come across gives as the basis of the definition, is what narratives are about, events. But the idea of event, I would suggest, begs the question. That's to say, an event is itself, in some sense, already caught up with narrative as a mode of understanding. So this is a definition that tries to talk about the form that constitutes narrative. The form that constitutes it at a very basic cognitive level. Semiotic articulation being something that you might say more simply in terms of the use of a representational medium to communicate, whether that's words or film or comic strip images or dance or whatever it might be. Those are the range of manifestations of narrative form. But here I want to use it in a way that incorporates the possibility that this is something that goes on in our minds at the level of cognition as well. And that has this very reductive attentional focus upon linear temporal sequence. And of course, its reductiveness is its strength. It makes it exceptionally efficient, and efficient because it is good enough for most practical purposes of sense making, but also in certain conditions makes it deeply inadequate And that inadequacy is compounded by the fact that we are so dependent upon narrative cognition, upon narrative as a mode of thinking. And indeed, the whole argument behind this paper, the tendency to assume that what you get when you get a narrative is access to a world, is symptomatic of that dependency. What I wanted to argue, and this is number 4, what I wanted to argue instead is that narrative cognition is something we need to recognize and defamiliarize to ourselves as a certain way of modeling the world, a way that conforms to a logic of its own and can be distinguished from other ways of modeling. And the one I was contrasting with most specifically here was spatial cognition, spatial modeling. And to notice that there are incommensurabilities between these different kinds of representation, these different kinds of articulation of the form of the object of inquiry, the world, whatever it is. Number 5, narrative cognition does not and cannot by itself comprehend the reality we inhabit. Narrative sense-making is partial, provisional, and interdependent with other modes of sense-making. Proposes that contrary to the assumption that tends to lie behind that kind of conventional wisdom that what you need to do in order to communicate ideas is to give a narrative account, give a story, a narrative account of those. The assumption behind that being that a narrative version of it gives us, in some sense, immediate access to what it's about. I'm suggesting that is a false assumption, and that the gaps that arise between the way in which narrative makes sense of things and other kinds of modeling, mathematical modeling being the one we're particularly interested in this project, the gaps that arise between those are gaps that ought to direct our attention to the need for a kind of complementarity between different kinds of sense making, different modeling modes, so that in order for narrative not to be mistaken as the benchmark for the intelligibility of a particular representation, a particular idea about the world, we need to recognize that it does not have that priority purely by virtue of being, in some sense, innate and native to our own way of thinking. And that's where number 7 comes in. The hierarchical relation between narrative and spatial cognition in the interpretation of narrative is one of semiotic priority. So that in an avowedly narrative text, as it is in the case of this novel, narrative is the dominant mode by virtue of it being offered precisely as a narrative, and that other kinds of sense making are subordinate to that. But that complementarity, whether it's within a narrative mode or within another mode, for instance, a kind of spatial modeling that might legitimately be the or spatiotemporal modeling for that matter, that might legitimately be the way of trying to conceptualize a certain phenomenon, complex phenomenon, for example, might be the dominant mode to which a narrative mode of meaning ought properly to be subordinated, so that narrative there would not have a kind of judicial kind of say about what made sense and what didn't from a communicative perspective, but merely be a way of foregrounding the differences between the incommensurabilities, indeed, between different modes of modeling, and indeed defamiliarizing the way in which the narrative mode of modeling may efface or miss crucial features that other models capture. Now, as it turned out, my colleagues had grasped that aspect of this paper I think, in a way that by turning it around from the context of thinking about fiction to the context of thinking about modeling the real world, indeed made what was originally a facetious and negative mode of argument something which has a potentially constructive and interesting relation to the larger interdisciplinary questions with which we're concerned, the questions of the potential and the challenges of communication, of models of complex environmental phenomena in relation to narrative as the privileged, notionally privileged medium of communication. Okay, I'm going to stop that at that point, because our assumption is that there will now be a wave of questions of various kinds. So perhaps I'll stop sharing my screen, unless, well, I can share again if we need to look back at this material. But it might be easy to. Do you agree? Do you want to take control of this, Annabelle?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Richard. Do we have any questions that anybody would like to ask? Oh, Bill.
Yeah, it's more to relate an experience I've just had trying, well, not just had, I've done it for a few years, trying to describe fisheries science in layman's terms without any equations.
Yeah.
And I managed it right up until the last minute when there was the most recent fisheries science. We've had to put some equations in the appendix. Just couldn't do it without. But anyway, so just sit down. When you see an equation, sit down and try and write it out in English. Try and make your narrative, your equations into narrative.
Yes, well, I suppose what I would want to say to that is that the effort to try and translate into narrative needs to be supplemented by, you know, a kind of meta discourse about the ways in which that is misrepresenting and not capturing parts of what's going on. Yeah. I think I come from fisheries science without the equations first. I come from visualizing the fish swimming in the sea and being caught by growing and being caught by the nets and so on. Yeah.
So I have a narrative view of the equations in the first place.
Okay, that's, and as most of us would, presumably.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way they design. That's the origin of it in the design of it. That the guys who did it, they obviously had some maths, but they looked at it from a process point of view. So it was a process of the fish going out, swimming in the sea and growing, and then they found the maths to describe that. So you don't actually need the maths there, unless you actually want to do it. Anyway, I'll.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill. I think that this is one of the things that I've. It's been noted a few times because I don't wish to offend any of mathematicians that we have here, but I think in my mind.
Have we lost Annabelle?
I think we've lost Annabelle.
She didn't offend a mathematician, did she? As your power is, yes.
Yeah, just don't mess with the mathematicians.
All right.
Susan had a question while we try and get Annabelle back.
Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, okay. It's going to be strange back in real life when people don't freeze. I'm not going to, I'm so used to people freezing randomly. One of the things, Richard, I was interested in was you were talking about these different modes of description and understanding might be incommensurable.
Yeah.
And so when I come across anything like that, I think, oh, well, the interesting bit's going to be in the precise places where they are incommensurable.
Yeah.
And how do you actually analyze things and find out where these incommensurable places are and any interesting bits that are going on in those places? I don't know whether that's a question for Richard or for the rest of the team or what.
Yeah, I think it's an open question, isn't it? But I mean, so the first step in that is to notice that things are not quite lining up, and that specifically in the case of narrative, noticing that the nature of the kind of representation that narrative privileges and the kind of relevance that it gains by virtue of doing that, communicative relevance that it gains by doing that, means that it has an attentional focus. It has blinkers on, in essence. And those blinkers are very deliberate, very kind of, inherently cutting out certain kinds of connections that by virtue of considering it in a narrative light, fall outside the scope of what is relevant to the sequential logic of that narrative.
So I'm used, when I'm modeling, if I can carry on probing into this, if that's okay, because when I'm modeling, one of the things that I like to try and document, lay clear is kind of the axioms and the underlying assumptions of the specific model I'm building. Is there any way of documenting those about the narrative model that's being built as well? I mean, is that the kind of thing that you can pick apart and say, well, actually, I'm assuming that this part is relevant and that part isn't, and therefore I'm doing a narrative about in that way?
Well, so you could do, I suppose the question here is how far you could do that in particular terms in relation to the particulars of what you're concerned with in any given case. I think you could, in a sense, you could begin by doing that, but sooner or later you would need to frame that in more abstract, general terms, more theoretical terms, essentially, about the way in which narrative works. Implicit in that is the challenge of being able to convey that in a way that is actually not more unintelligible than the original problem in the first place. John, go on.
So firstly, Robin has been trying to find Annabelle, and it looks like she has been destroyed by her lack of respect for mathematicians. Right, yeah. So it's up to the rest of us to chair this, and I'll do my best to do so. But I did have a question. I'm going to admit you were very polite in saying it was our team misunderstood the irony and satire. It was me. It went way over my head. I'm the mathematician. I just read what's in front of me. And that misunderstanding was really useful for me, if slightly embarrassing. But I found myself, as you were going through it again, wondering if you said that there's a dominant narrative mode, and there are some other orthogonal dimensions which are being brought in and used cognitively somehow to convey a bigger message. That there must be examples or bad examples where there are multiple temporal narrative modes, or where the non-temporal mode has the priority. And so are there good or bad examples there?
Well, so part of the reason why jealousy is such a good case study for this question is because, although it is a narrative, a lot of the time it looks like a description. It works as if it is describing the world, the environment, the specific environment of the novel in incredibly fine detail. But the fact that those two things are, respond differently according to what you understand the communicative point of doing that to be, becomes immediately apparent when you understand the basic principle of the novel, which is that all these descriptions convey a perspective, which is the perspective of the jealous husband in the novel, who is never directly referred to. And in that sense, what matters is not what is being described, but the perspective of the act of describing, the narration itself, that form. And indeed, so I was quite mischievous in offering to my fellow narrative theorists the possibility that this approach might disentangle the complicated chronology of the novel, because in fact it's very easy to show just by inspection of the narration itself that it isn't coherent. It's deliberately self-contradictory, and that doesn't matter, because what it's there for is to convey well, on the one hand, this subjective point of view. Hello, Annabelle, you're back. And on the other hand, for the sake of the literary textual surface of the novel, which was in some sense Rogier's primary interest, so that the world of the novel is nowhere in that conception of what it's for. But as I said, if we turn that around and we think about an analogous case in which we're not interested in fiction as a literary mode, but we are interested in the question of the relation between a world or a particular environment or a particular object of representation, and how a narrative may or may not be adequate to describing it, to representing it, to the extent that it has a temporal process, then I think all the same questions arise, but they arise the other way up, as it were, so that they become part of what we need to take into account as we engage the challenges of doing so. Your hand, that's a new hand, isn't it, Susan?
It is.
Yes, okay.
Sorry, I was just waiting for anybody else wanted to jump in. Yeah. So this thing about the point and the perspective and so on. I just want to bring in. I read a lot of science fiction, and there's a really nice essay on science fiction reading protocols and how they're very different from ordinary literary reading protocols, as in what questions you ask of the story. And the little example given is just the phrase, "her world exploded." And if you were reading that in a literary sense or something, you'd ask what terrible misfortune had happened to her and so on. Whereas if you were a science fiction reader, you would ask, how did this world explode? What was it completely devastated? And when it's her world, did she actually own this planet, or was she merely living on it? And so they're very different kinds of questions you ask. And it struck me that that's the kind of thing that we need to take into account here, is how do we make narratives where we get the, given there are very different questions you can ask of it and very different answers that you can get, as you so facetiously demonstrated in your own misreading, maybe, of this novel. How do we know? How can we kind of control? Should that even be the right question? The kinds of ways people are reading the narratives when they're being used to help scientific and real world cognition rather than fictional cognition. So what that quite nicely conveys is the contextual contingency of narrative communication, of communication generally. It places the question of communication not in the light of what is true, but what is pragmatically and contextually relevant, and that there are two sides to that. So the first of that means that there's the respect in which that is in play in the mode of presentation itself, or the different possible modes of presentation, different in the narrative mode, for example, being a salient one, but also the way in which and I think perhaps in the fisheries project that we've been talking about is a good example of that. The various interests, the various stakeholders, the various parties to communication about this project will have very different notions of what the parameters of relevance, what the nature of the context actually is, and those will be contested in certain respects, so that there's a dual challenge, one of which is intrinsic and one of which is contextual. Lindsay, you're coming in there.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, because it fits nicely with my interest in the project as well. And we've had discussions about the IPCC report and my involvement in the IPCC process. And the narrative within that report is aiming to present the scientific perspective, but then we've got various figures and diagrams and things which convey another way of presenting the narrative, which may or may not be at odds with the science and the text. And there's that kind of, it links to what Annabelle said in her introduction about kind of the vulnerabilities that we create for ourselves when we use narrative, because it could kind of provide an entry point for, in this case, for countries to step in and say, well, actually, what about this or what about that? And it kind of lays bare some of the assumptions at times. So I'm not really asking a question with this. I'm just putting it out there that there's that other context to add. And if you stick a political layer over the top as well, then it kind of gets, the waters get even muddier, so to say. So for me, that's been an interesting part of watching the IPCC process, to see how it all kind of comes together and plays out, and the power that narrative can have, and how that shapes then the power relations of the discussions that take place as well.
Thank you, Lindsay. I mean, perhaps I'll add to that, since you kind of pointed out the way in which a political, broadly understood political dimension can very, very naturally come into play in relation to these questions of the contextual parameters of the discussion. One of the inherent implications of the perspectival, the multiple perspectival qualities of narrative representation, along with its tacit claim to be not about itself but about the world, is an essentially political subtext. That's to say, a rhetorical force that is tendentious in political or ideological terms, or simply in terms of interest groups. Where just by virtue of taking a particular perspective, it constitutes an alignment, and unless steps are taken to make that alignment explicit, or to complement that alignment with counterbalancing other narratives or other modes of representation, then that can be a pernicious force in the argument, in the discussion. Bill.
Yeah, in this context, and it relates to climate change and carbon reduction, I saw a graph the other day of European and UK emissions going down, and China and India going up in terms of carbon emissions. And my first thought was, well, that's all very well, but are the EU, UK exporting carbon emissions? And there was no mention in the text anywhere of this discussion like that. And it presumably somebody would probably put it in, but they cleaned out by the politicians in their context, trying to show a context. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, I suspect it has been cleaned, and even with the IPCC negotiations, it wasn't necessarily diluting the narrative. It was using different words to express the same thing in a way that was more agreeable and that could have buy-in from more of the people that were there. Which you could argue, well, that does change the narrative, because it's kind of changing the emphasis within the sentence or whatever else. But yeah, in your graphs, Bill, I suspect that there's been information that's been taken out, information that's been emphasized in different ways to create a particular political position.
I don't know. I might be wrong, and I didn't read the whole methodology of it. But it's always struck me that take one country's emissions in isolation. That's you're not, unless you're explicitly accounting for what they import, then you're not really. It's not the whole picture. But anyway.
And there's also a scale question as well. What time scale are you looking at emissions changes over? What methods are being used to assess those emissions? Yeah. Again, it's information that's either in or out that then can shape the overall direction of what's being said.
I have to reread the paper to see if I can find out whether they're taking into account exporting emissions, but I don't think they were.
John, do you want to come in?
It's just we're all talking about the narrative, and what Bill has articulated is the fact that there could be many narratives taken from a single set of words or a single picture on a piece of paper, which is both exciting and worrying, because people will take their own personal story. And I know that Richard knows much more about this than I do, but it's a fear that I have, that we tell these wonderful stories, using stories in the correct term, but they're interpreted by people in the way they wish to hear them. And that must be a real worry for Lindsay.
Hopefully use these types of discussions and understanding how the narratives work. Hopefully that can, like I said in the introduction, hopefully that can give us a little bit more confidence or a little bit more control and reduce that vulnerability that we feel, at least by understanding how these things work. I have made my sacrifices to the maths gods to beg forgiveness. I will never ever criticize them again. I will, though, because we're coming to the end of time, I'm just going to share one more slide. So I said at the start that this is more of an introductory session about some of the ideas. But we have a follow-up event on the 31st of March. And at that event, we're going to be applying some of the ideas that we've been talking about here to 2 different areas. Lindsay, thank you very much, has already started to have a bit of an introduction to the IPCC, some of the discussions around that. John, I don't know whether you want to spend a minute or two just talking a little bit about your Pyramids of Life project and the relationship to this narratives discussion.
I could do it in less than a minute, I think.
Okay.
So it's a big, complicated program with all of these partners, and I'm leading it. I don't know half of what's going on, and I think that's fine, because it's such a big, ambitious project. I shouldn't know about it. And it's unified by this concept of pyramids, which everybody instantly gets, and they buy on. They just think, wow, pyramids, strong, stable, what a great thing. And that worries me, because pyramids are everywhere and they're open to misinterpretation. I didn't even realize that the pyramid on the dollar bill until I looked just now has got a separate pyramid on top, raising on top, because that's God's pyramid, looking at on the human pyramid, pyramids of needs, pyramids of wealth, pyramids of numbers in ecologies. So what I'm scared of is being able to have our good science, where we do have these emergent pyramids from ecology, and we know that from behavioral science and from economics there are pyramids, but to be able to honestly understand those interrelationships to produce things which things which can change the fish that we catch and the fish that we eat. So that's my paranoid take on this so far. Lindsay, do you want to talk about your?
I won't say anything more about IPCC, because I think I've kind of alluded to some of the challenges and the issues that might come up in the workshop. Do you want to talk about your smart motorways, John?
Well, so this is another one which is just so seductive and wrong. So smart motorways exist. We're used to motorways. Things go slowly in the slow lane. You overtake and go into the fast lane and the faster lane and so on, and they're full of traffic jams. And the reason why is that people turn out into these outer lanes, and that causes people behind to slow down. And the maths is all well understood. You get these cascades of instability, and it jams up the whole thing. Smart motorways, everybody goes at a speed we can all go at, 40 or 50. There's no reason to change lanes, and you have this stable flow of traffic at a slower speed, but the average productivity of the system is massively increased. So they're just plain brilliant, except of course they aren't, because people die on them. And we've learned the only way to have safe, smart motorways is if you have these little refuges you can see in the picture where a broken down car can hide. And if you have a lot of traffic cameras making sure that you can intervene if there's something bad. You imagine in fisheries management, that's great. This is saying, let's have balanced harvest. Let's harvest equally across all the size categories. And let's make sure we've got these checks and balances and monitoring to make sure it's all safe. What a beautiful, clean narrative. And it's absolute rubbish, because the only reason you have this ecological pyramid is because the cars in the fast lanes are eating the cars in the small lanes and becoming even faster. And so the mechanism by which this emerges is completely at odds in those 2 examples. And yet I can see, talking to people at DEFRA, that they get this smart motorways idea instantly. And there's a worry there as a scientist. Are they getting it because it's so seductive, even though it misses the main mechanism that causes it in the fisheries case?
And that's a really nice introduction to the workshop. Thank you, John. So we'll be focusing a little bit more on examples like that and John's Fishy Highway in the workshop. Please do sign up. I've just dropped the link into the chat. And if you would be kind enough as well to leave us any feedback, or if you have any questions or comments about this. We're just about out of time, so it just leaves me to thank all of the project participants, but also everybody for taking part and coming and giving all of your questions and comments. So please do be in touch, and we hope to see you at the workshop in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.